Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of our CBS. We hope you've been enjoying it so far. What a great presentation we had from Kaylin earlier. My name is Melissa Heinrich, and I'm a structural engineer in training and a project manager in our Vancouver office, and I'm very excited to be your moderator for this session. Just a couple of reminders about the InEvent platform and some of the features to the right of our screen. Please use them. Use the chats, use the questions and the polls. Please remember to enter your questions for the presenters in the questions tab and not in the chats tab. We will also have a couple of polls released throughout the presentations just to ensure that you're still awake. One presentation I'm absolutely certain you will not fall asleep to is we have Mr. Malcolm Shield opening up our theme for the seminar regarding the complexity of resiliency. His presentation will be followed by a guaranteed riveting panel discussion by our friends here at Associated Engineering about what it means to design a resilient building. Malcolm is undoubtedly the perfect person to kick off our resiliency discussions today. He has more than 20 years of experience in this field, and for the last 10 years, Malcolm has been advising governments in Canada and internationally on climate change with a focus on the related risks due to physical changes in our environment, markets that result from decarbonization. Malcolm regularly collaborates and assists organizations to plan and make decisions to support and influence change. During our introductions, we have found out and we'll be releasing some very interesting facts about our presenters today. I was recently made aware that Mr. Sustainability was once a huge climate change cliche, as years ago he worked on an oil tanker for an entire month. Although we won't hold that against him, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Malcolm and his presentation on what does it mean to be resilient in a time of radical uncertainty, where so often it's said that buildings are like people, each in their own character, their own quirks, each aging in their own way. Malcolm will explore what it entails to be resilient, not only within the changing climate or post-disaster, but also for buildings to maintain a community that is inclusive and equitable. Malcolm, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks kindly, Melissa. Appreciate the introduction. I would like to recognize that I'm here in Vancouver and I'm thankful for being on the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam and the Tsleil-Waututh. Canada has a long history and as I'm sure you can tell from my accent, I am an immigrant to Canada, and it's a country that has welcomed me with open arms, and I think that's a reflection of, in many respects, what it does mean to be resilient. The future that we look to is one that is changing. It is one that is very much characterized by uncertainty. And I think it's important to recognize that we all bring our personal perspectives to that in terms of our own lives, our own lived experiences and our professional experiences. And so I do pose the question, well, what does it mean to be resilient in a time of radical uncertainty? And as we go through this session, you'll soon realize that I don't provide an answer to that question. I provide further things that we should be considering and thinking about when we try to work to understand what that means for each of us. But first, what are we talking about when we mean or discuss radical uncertainty itself? Uncertainty in the traditional sense can often be expressed by percentages, probabilities, which of themselves are informed by historic trends. But what about those cases where we can't use statistical analysis or historic trends to inform the future that we're heading towards or the conditions that we need to plan for? What do we do then? That is the nature of radical uncertainty. And as Mervyn King, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, once said, it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And for engineers, architects, those of us who come from the analytical trades, this is a very difficult place for us to be. So the question is, well, what do we do with that? So the question comes to hand, well, what do we mean by resilience? In the traditional sense, or the most common sense of the word, it's often been perceived as response to disaster, the engineering response to what if we have buildings and facilities that need to withstand earthquake or are known to be in an area that's prone to flooding. Particularly as we've all seen in the news over the past 15 months, wildfire is really coming to the fore as one of those considerations. But this is a somewhat traditional conversation around resilience to physical disaster risk. That's not to say that we can ignore it, but there are additional accretive considerations to look to. As part of that resilience, we should be thinking about what does it mean to recover from that disaster? Is the building likely to be playing a role in the recovery from disaster? Will it have an alternative use on a temporary basis? Be it an emergency shelter, for those of us who remember the images, particularly from Hurricane Katrina, and how some of the large sports facilities were used as emergency shelters at the time. Potentially, will buildings play a role in command and control during the disaster or immediately after? So let's start thinking a little bit when we think to our buildings as to what is that range of use cases that we need to be considering as we look to our design conditions. But then also moving on from that, and when we start moving into the reconstruction phase, have I thought about my building in the most appropriate way? Did I think about my material choices to be able to ease reconstruction? If I have, for example, a building in a floodplain, do I improve the water, in essence, the flood resilience of the building for the first 2 or 3 feet above the flood level, so that building no longer has to be reconstructed? One of the big ones that we often talk about is plasterboard and drywall. Post flooding, there is a lot of work entailed in the replacement of drywall. Do we have alternatives that we could be using so that reconstruction need is less? And by extension, can we also look at a smaller material palette for buildings to simplify that reconstruction and also have positive environmental benefit on often the emissions side? When we look to the embodied emissions that come from a reduced material palette, it's often preferential to having a much wider range of materials used in construction. And similarly, can we look at modularized approaches to ease that reconstruction effort and bring buildings back online in a more speedy way, which also goes to post-disaster. What does my site access look like? It's no longer just about the building, it's about my siting and how, particularly for critical buildings and critical infrastructure, that reconstruction phase is going to look like. But moving beyond that immediate sort of disaster lens, there's a number of other aspects that we need to look to for when considering resilience. And climate change in many ways is just exacerbating existing risks. These existing disasters that we were talking about, be it flooding, be it wildfire, be it extreme rain, those acute stresses to the building, like that, the so-called shocks that buildings have to withstand. What is a building's role within that? But climate change is one of those challenges that is certainly long run. It's long-term time horizons, but we are seeing such rates of change in our environment that we need to be tackling those long-range issues now, and particularly given the lifetime that the infrastructure and buildings we construct last for. And so we can no longer focus on just these acute shocks. We need to be also thinking about the chronic stressors, particularly for coastal cities. Sea level rise is a significant stressor. For more inland areas, drought, long-term changes in precipitation and climatic conditions related with heat. Drought can be a particular challenge if you have significant underground infrastructure, because as the ground dries and heaves, you place additional strain and stress on the linear infrastructure. But what about some of those other additional long-term changes? Changes around air pollution, because we know that in general combustion, and particularly combustion of fossil fuels, is a significant driver of air pollution. What about the role of disease? Certainly in our current climate, this is one that cannot be ignored, and no one can claim to be naive to it anymore. And for some communities, food security is also turning up as a long-term chronic stressor. What does secured access to food look like? What are the storage implications, particularly when we start to tie this with disaster? And so, in essence, the only way to start managing these conversations is to fundamentally recognize that we need to reduce vulnerability for both our infrastructure and our people. And that reduced vulnerability can potentially tie to passive solutions that are less equipment intensive, that has benefits around increased resilience, but also utility cost benefits, greenhouse gas benefits. However, when we look at the physical risk of climate change, this is only one side of the coin. We can really start to think about, well, what does risk look like in general? Risk is so often defined as likelihood multiplied by consequence. Well, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what's consequence? What's the consequence of something failing or coming close to failure? And for many clients, particularly municipal clients or infrastructure clients, that ties to first level of service. What is it that the service that my equipment, my facility, my building is looking to achieve? And it is also tied to the vulnerability, the extent to which my facility will be impacted. But the vulnerability itself is also a product of the exposure to the risk, the sensitivity to that risk, the negative consequence for the people or the facility, and the response capacity, the extent to which a building or people can respond to an event. And exposure is just the product of an intensity and a duration. But what we see here on the screen is what's in green lends itself well to analytical approaches. We can tell you what the likelihood of a certain event is. We can suggest what the likely exposure might be. But what's in red is an inherently human aspect. Level of service is subjective. It's a choice that is made around the level of service to which we wish to deliver. And similarly, sensitivity and response capacity, the extent to which I am affected or my facility is affected, is different depending on the people involved, the community involved, the timing, and similarly the response capacity. So the important thing to realize is that resilience is not fundamentally a question solely of analytical response. There is a clear human element that must be brought into considering resilience. But then, what about these broader systemic risks that we're talking about? And particularly from a climate perspective, we're talking about that decarbonization transition. And that brings with it risks associated with technology change. It brings with it risks around reputation. Our clients are those that we work with exposed to a new reputational risk if they are not seen or genuinely integrating the changing climate into how they conduct business. There's going to be legal changes associated with a changing climate. The geophysical basis for climate change cannot be argued with. And so the question is around at what time do we start to build in the consideration to climate change? And it's better to start getting out ahead of the curve and presaging what we know will come and the implications for that from a legal or a reporting point of view, reputation, technology. And for those of us who do provide products and services, is my market going to change? Is the changing nature because of how integrated energy is to everything we do going to change in future? And so is this an opportunity to start thinking bigger? Is there a role for buildings to be regenerative? Can buildings actually be have negative emissions profiles over their lifetime? What is the role of embodied emissions within buildings and facilities? Can new facilities help either rehabilitate or repurpose or improve the performance of existing ones? And as we heard earlier in the keynote, this emergent conversation around autonomous vehicles or ACEs, autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. We're starting to see a growing integration between buildings and electrification, or rather integration of buildings and transportation as transportation itself is electrified. So this is climate risk. This is a disaster risk. But at the end of the day, we need to understand that finance, economics, the role of the dollar, the euro, the yen is still fundamental to what business does and how it delivers. And so we should also be thinking about financial resilience, the ability for a building to be repurposed through its lifetime to improve that financial investment. Can buildings draw in preferential investment if they are more resilient? Or we're starting to see an emergent trend towards assets, the value of assets being linked to their risk exposure, and also a move to start looking at buildings through their entire long-term cost returns. This is no longer just the short-termism that comes with construction and then selling on the building. Financial resilience can potentially start changing the lens by which we consider buildings and facilities. But as I said at the start, buildings are nothing without people. It's people that also help to make sure that our facilities are resilient. What is the role of a building or a facility within its community? What is the function that it provides? Or alternatively, how does that building fit into the community, not just through its function, but how does it impact that community? Is the construction of a 4-story walk-up the same as the construction of a 18-story mid-level, low-level, high-rise on the ground level community? And it has to be emphasized that a building cannot be resilient unless the community around it is resilient. Buildings exist at the service of people. They're not there to serve themselves. They're there to service a community in some way, shape, or form. And that does tie to the questions as to occupant health. So we spoke about the community and what's external to the building, but also buildings obviously play a key role to those who are the occupants and users of the building. Indoor air quality is really the one that often jumps to mind. And through COVID, of course, the conversation has fundamentally changed in the last 8 months. But other aspects, such as wildfires, those communities who have suffered wildfires recently have really understood that air quality and indoor air quality particularly tie together, in buildings' ability to ensure that we have good air quality inside for occupant health, productivity, and in essence, providing the function that a building must. And of course, it goes to lighting conditions, noise, everything that it is to create the most appropriate indoor environment. And so to date, everything that we've discussed so up to this point has been, to some extent, very clearly defined. But for many people in society, and I would argue for all of us, when you ask, well, who are you? You're not defined by a single thing. I'm not just an engineer. I'm also someone who skis. I'm not just someone who works in the social services. I'm also someone who is a mother to two children. You are not defined by a single thing. And this is really starting to be reflected in design considerations for building, these so-called intersectional considerations. We're used to talking about, say, physical accessibility aspects for buildings, but going beyond that, how do I interact with a building based upon my age, my ethnicity? What's the mental accessibility for that building? And what really happens when these start to come together? What if I am someone who is a person of color who uses a wheelchair? How does my interaction with a building change? What if I am an elderly person who has mobility challenges and I'm female? How does that look different to the classic able-bodied white male that is where a lot of design perspectives come from? And this extends obviously to the LGBTQ plus conversation as to gender and the role of gender within design. And for those of you who work, as we heard earlier from Kaylin in Edmonton, and also growing here for provincial projects in BC, the role of GBA plus, gender-based analysis plus, and it goes beyond gender. It's somewhat of a misnomer to think that GBA is purely a gender lens. And so really we're starting to bring these different aspects together. And so this is a question, resilience is a question of complexity and how we manage that complexity. We can't ignore it. We have to embrace it. The world is a complicated place and it's not going to get any more simple in the future. So we must look to solutions around the use of integrated design processes, structured decision making to manage that complexity, and a recognition that not all solutions are technical. This is not wholly a technical consideration. It's part of it, but is not solely that. And then finally, a recognition that there is never a single solution. Any single building or same building is always going to be in a different location. So I'd close with the final observation that there are better solutions out there. We know that we can be doing better, and it's a question of how we achieve that. So with that, I hope I've left you with plenty to think about, and we'll now move into the panel discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Malcolm. That's a great presentation, and we'll touch on a lot of those topics today with further presentations. And yes, we'll transition over to the panelists for further discussion on what it means to be involved in designing a resilient building. So at Associated Engineering, I feel very fortunate to have such knowledgeable colleagues, and this panel certainly highlights my point. Sitting on our panel today, we have our talented electrical engineering specialist, Louis De Lange, with 26 years of experience on a wide range of industrial, transportation, water and wastewater, power distribution, building services projects. Louis worked on the first institutional passive house project certified in Canada in Okanagan College Daycare Centre in Penticton. He is also currently involved in the Parcel 21 project on the SFU campus, which is a near passive house multifamily residential apartment complex. Furthermore, Louis has made it a life goal to prove that the weatherman is never wrong. He has personally installed and maintained several private weather stations. These stations upload data to public weather networks. He has also built his own weather station, including writing all the code and functions. Louis never ceases to amaze. We also have the inspiring Andrew Wong. He's a mechanical designer in our Markham's Building Services and Engineering and Energy group with us today. He has experience in buildings and energy sectors that includes research and development, design, site reviews, and on-site asset management for various multidisciplinary industrial processes and building upgrade projects. Andrew is extremely passionate about sustainable design practices and staying abreast on the latest green building industry trends. Now, Andrew also takes extreme pride of what is in his fridge. Typically, you'll find a wide assortment of experimental bitters, liqueurs, and syrups for cocktail making. Although COVID has put a pause on some of his get-togethers, Andrew soon hopes to be able to share some drinks with his friends again in the near future. This easily explains why Andrew is always so energetic all the time, and I'm also looking forward to that post-COVID invitation. Last, but certainly not least, we have the wonderful Carma Holmes. Carma has over 20 years of experience, primarily focused on structural design and project management of buildings for communities throughout Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Carma also serves as vice chair on the City of Edmonton Design Committee and is a past director with the Construction Specifications of Canada. In all of her abundance of spare time, Carma has been learning sign language in a virtual classroom to make a more positive influence in children's lives. This woman is essentially a saint and makes me rethink my poor life choices on the regular. I have not one punny thing to say about you. We love you, Carma. And after my long-winded introduction, I'll pass over the torch to Malcolm to moderate this panel's discussion. Thanks, Malcolm.
Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate it. Yeah, so I think over the next 35 minutes or so, we'll run through a few questions and try and pick up on some of the different perspectives that I teed up through my presentation. But first of all, just to understand where the audience is at a little bit, we do have an opening poll question for you. So Melissa, could you run our first poll question, please? So according to Environment and Climate Change Canada, how much more is Canada warming compared to the global average? What do people think? How's it? So head over to the polls tab for those of you, top right-hand side, third button across. Is it less than the global average, equal to the global average, twice as much, 10 times as much? So the reason we put this one up when we were thinking about where to position things is just a recognition that Canada is warming faster than the global average. We discussed climate change as a risk through my presentation, and it's important to recognize that climate change is not uniform. It affects different geographies in different ways, and the same is true of so many resilience aspects. And Northern Canada particularly is suffering climate change worse than others. And so this idea that resilience is really a local consideration. But there's so many other considerations to go with resilience, and that's where I'd like to open. Andrew, if I could ask you to comment on this recognition that resilience is a large topic. It covers a wide range of different aspects, considerations. There's no universal definition. There's no universal standard. Would welcome your thoughts on really how do we bring this together?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Malcolm. First of all, great presentation. And I guess to start off, I would wholeheartedly agree that resilience is a daunting task, no matter who you are. And in response to the question of how we bring it all together, I would probably say there are two key points to be made. The first is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, that we're going to need creative and flexible approaches applied on various scales. So I think that's point number one. And point number two is that, echoing a point that you made in terms of how we bring it all together, is that embracing and realizing incremental change is better than trying to achieve everything at once. I think, like you shared, it's better to be roughly right than, precisely wrong. And so I think to dive into that a bit deeper, resilience, necessitates the need to embrace complexity, but with the caveat that it has to be done in a manageable way. Like you said, there's no widely accepted or applicable standard that can be used or referenced for every single project or every single location. However, what we can do is we can seek to use processes that simplify this complexity and that help us understand what matters to our project team, that helps us educate our clients and collaborators, and ultimately facilitates the co-development of solutions. And this is really echoes, again, 2 points you made, the essence of integrated design processes and structured decision-making, we can use specific tools such as Envision, LEAD, Rely. The Toronto Green Standard out here in Ontario has been definitely a leader, not just locally, but I think nationwide. And there are a number of other frameworks, whether it's the WELL standard, FitWell, zero emissions frameworks. But at the end of the day, it's important to recognize that there's no one solution or framework that meets all needs. I know that at AE, there are two examples that come to mind to answer this is regarding how we bring it all together. The first is the use of our climate change screening tool. Some of our project teams may have experience using that. And what that does, it allows us to look at adaptation mitigation strategies at the project level and system and even at the asset level. And we're continuing to develop that for energy systems right now, and we're considering how this can also be expanded to touch on resilience. And the second example that immediately comes to mind is our recent adoption of using Envision, noting that we have a strong team of Envision practitioners, especially out west, that allow us to use those frameworks and guidelines to, again, take a very complex problem and tackle it in a manageable way. So I think that's how we can start the conversation and the dialogue, by understanding it's a complex problem, but ultimately using structured decision making and the tools that we have to come up with creative solutions.
Appreciated. Thank you. I think, expanding on that a little bit, there's, I think, a recognition that engineering is, as a profession, it's changed significantly in the last 20 years. It's taking much more inclusive approaches. Engineering teams and multidisciplinary teams are more wide-ranging than they were. The profession itself is moving away from prescriptive codes and standards to more performance-based code standards. A lot of infrastructure is now being perceived through a risk lens rather than a hazard lens. And in that respect, Louis, could I ask you to comment on how you think these changes do integrate with a resilience conversation as engineering as a profession changes its outlook to problem solving?
Well, thank you, Malcolm. I think that the first examples that come to mind as far as performance-based codes, the BC Energy Step Code that was first introduced in 2018 basically took, or it didn't do away with the prescriptive process completely, but it introduced the performance-based standard as a way to come up with solutions for projects in the sense that it gives the engineers the opportunity to come up with better solutions as long as it can meet a certain standard, as opposed to getting so specific as to tell the building designers exactly how many windows is allowed in a building. Another example of this is the EGBC dam guidelines that now uses a risk-based design approach and not a hazardous or hazard-based approach. An example of a code that is still very prescriptive is the Canadian Electrical Code. My fellow electrical engineers here will understand what I mean by that. I have specific examples of working on projects with passive house design approaches, where I was getting significant pushback from electrical inspectors and utilities that questioned the size of the electrical service to that building when the building itself was designed as a passive house, and they were not willing to accept the the relatively low demand that might or that the buildings would need, despite the fact that the building was designed as a passive house and would use very little energy. I think that engineers can shape the conversation about resiliency by using their technical perspectives and balance these with input from other disciplines. An example that comes to mind is from my background in water and wastewater treatment. We often go out of our way to improve resiliency in the design of these plants by process redundancy. But if we combine decisions related to process redundancy with decisions related to electrical redundancy within our designs, we can actually achieve a more resilient solution, potentially for a lower cost, that leaves us with a plant that is more resilient in terms of the ability to withstand shocks to the system.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Appreciate those perspectives. It is important to realize that as much as I tried to paint a picture of resilience being a very expansive consideration, that the technical aspects, some of the traditional technical aspects to maintaining resilience still hold true. We're not saying that these no longer apply. It's about the other lenses we need to be bringing through when considering resilience. And in that sense, Carma, could I ask you to perhaps comment on the fact that different organizations have different drivers for resilience? So what is it that's forcing them or considering the resilience aspects? And one of those is long-term financial stability, long-term considerations, and how that long-term view of assets can turn up in client conversations and how we think about resilience.
That's a good question, Malcolm. Over the years, as we've attended, the Canadian Green Building Council conferences and heard from different parts of the country, it's definitely become common for pension funds who are investors in these real estate assets to really look at the long-term value of their decisions. And climate is one of the things that they are looking at and they are paying attention to. There's evidence that what they call ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, those are the factors that they do actually consider when they're putting together their portfolios. There's property managers in major cities in Canada who are able to, because of their knowledge about the benefits of addressing climate and well-being, they can charge higher rent for buildings with that have a LEED designation or buildings that follow the WELL standard. There's a developer in Vancouver, for example, who actually no longer invests in buildings even if they're near or within the 1 in 100 year floodplain. So certainly from the private sector, there is their ability to get a return on investment definitely when they address climate and resiliency in general.
Thank you. Yes, it very much is an emergent conversation on the financial side. In the last 2 years, ESG, environmental and social and governance aspects to how investment choices are made, and there's still a patchwork of frameworks around that, but their core emphasis is the same in terms of making sure that long-term value is preferenced over short-term returns, and that value needs to be respectful of a broader set of considerations. So appreciate the comments there. I think we've got one more poll to run, so if I could ask all the attendees to jump over to the poll. We have another question for you. So in Canada, air pollution, how many premature deaths a year does air pollution cause in Canada? I was encouraged to see, I should pass comment on the first poll, that nearly 60% you got it right, to see that Canada's warming twice as fast. So where are we? Oh, it's a little more divided this time. So on the air pollution side, one thinks it's less than 1,000. This is encouraging. We know that 11% think 1370. And then the big debate. So the winner has just started to come through on a 2019 health count, 14,000 mature deaths. So this is deaths that are additional, that come sooner because of air quality consideration or air quality impacts in Canada. Canada, compared to many countries, and certainly our cities in Canada, have better air quality than many. But the reason that we ask this question is to emphasize that just because something is perceived as being reasonable, we're not Beijing, we're not Delhi in most cases, although for those of you in Alberta, those of you in Vancouver, the recent wildfire occurrences have really pushed air quality considerations to the fore, because those cities were starting to experience air quality impacts that were significantly worse than normal, and starting to tie into those that we might see in Beijing or Delhi. So air quality is still an important consideration for us. And in that sense, Louis, could I ask for your thoughts on how things have changed with COVID? I know that we're starting to reconsider ventilation strategies. And how are we looking at this link between air quality, occupant health, building performance?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. One of our follow-up discussions or presentations later will actually talk specifically about the impact of COVID to ventilation systems. So I don't want to preempt that, other than to say that I am currently involved with a specific project where a school design approach to the building ventilation has been modified specifically to follow a different methodology to minimize the distribution of the COVID-19 virus. It doesn't take a lot to realize that the exact same question will extend to how do you need to modify building systems to allow recreation facilities, senior housing, to allow people to effectively get together, and how they can be protected while they get together. It is actually very interesting to find that there are ways to handle the ventilation in these facilities while still minimizing the distribution of the virus. And then, of course, it doesn't take long to realize that the same principles that you can apply to controlling indoor air quality to manage COVID can obviously then extend to wildfire smoke, and a growing awareness that indoor air quality in general matters as much as that outside. This past year, I think a lot of our regions have been affected by wildfire smoke, and certainly in BC and specifically in the Lower Mainland, we had extended periods of pretty poor air quality. The ventilation systems are obviously and the design of these systems are obviously starting to take that into account. And in the end, this is what makes or what will make buildings and communities more resilient.
Appreciate that. Thanks. I think in many ways the conversations we're having around resilience are at their core, they're not new, they're just a new perspective on conversations we've had in the past. As I said in my presentation, climate change is typically an amplifier of existing risk. I do think I'd recognize some of the gender or the ethnicity or the intersectional issues as being a fundamentally new way to look at buildings and the role of that. But more broadly, a lot of the conversation, I think, is about expanding upon traditional engineering approaches, but applying them in different ways. If we use traditional approaches to design into the future, we're still going to end up with the same solutions. So it's a question of how do we take those approaches, knowledge, insights, and skills, and in essence, reimagine them somewhat, and reimagine them in the client-specific or the project-specific context, since resilience means different things to different people, different organizations. And in that respect, Andrew, I'd appreciate your thoughts on, could you potentially comment on how you've seen that perspective vary or be seen differently for different types of organizations or different types of, in our case, clients or projects?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think some of the broad themes that we've touched on today are that there are different perspectives and that, a typical lens can no longer be applied. It's a multifaceted problem that has to be tackled. I would think by way of just example, in terms of what those different resilience perspectives might look like, I think I'll start with a dense urban core, being in the GTA here. Resilience might consider factors such as the growing population, shifting demographics, maintaining essential services in the face of acute stressors, as well as chronic ones. It's talking about how we build around robust transportation links and also healthy community spaces. Mm-hmm.
Oh, Andrew, did we lose you?
And for rural communities.
You're back. We lost you for a bit, Andrew. Oh. Sorry, we lost you for about 30 seconds.
Oh.
We were just talking about your community spaces in Toronto.
Yeah, so community spaces and ultimately climate impacts. Those could be resilience considerations for an urban center. Now, if we shift and look at maybe a more rural or even First Nations communities, it could be themes of resilient energy sources. How to have resilient community infrastructure, local supply chains and material usage that allows communities to be independent. Food, economic, water security. Those are themes that we'd consider potentially in those scenarios. And really, I think the take-home message is, again, given that complexity, given this multifaceted challenge, the hope is that, similar to the growing conversations about sustainable design that we've been having over the 5, 10, 15 years, that all stakeholders, whether it's owners, operators, designers, will engage in these conversations about what resilience looks like for their project, for their community, and really their future, so that they can co-develop a clear vision for the projects and communities. And after establishing that vision that reflects the perspective and the value project processes and technologies that promote resilience.
Appreciate it. Yes, sure. Thank you. I think we've got a few problems with your signal, but we caught the last little bits there. I think from my perspective, one of the pieces when we talk about resilience that I'm also very aware of when we look to this complexity is that it's perceived as being something that's wholly new, transformational. We need to do everything differently. And as with so many aspects of organizational change or behavior change, we have more success when we find ways to piggyback or integrate new approaches into current ways of thinking, current business process, current policy. And in that respect, I think there's a very close tie between asset management when we look particularly to communities, be it large multi-million population communities or First Nations communities, and the role of how do we manage our assets for maximum value in the long term. And in that respect, Carma, could I ask you to pass a bit of comment on that in terms of asset management is a reasonably well-established but growing field, and what the relationship with a resilience conversation might look like in that respect?
Yeah, I think this is a good question that kind of touches close to home. A lot of times in the news or within our communities, when we hear about asset management, we usually hear about level of service, and most people think that level of service is really just about how quick of a response time there is. Like, when will I get my my cable hooked up, or those kinds of things. But in the true definition in asset management, level of service is about much more than the response time. It's actually, it covers a lot of the similar things that we've talked about with resiliency. Level of service is also about reliability. It's about safety. It's about capacity. It's emissions and environmental impacts. Level of service also really touches on affordability and code compliance. So if we were to really just reach into our knowledge of good asset management principles and really look at level of service holistically, I think a lot of the things that we already have established in asset management practices really do apply to making a building more resilient or a community more resilient. The two are very much interlinked.
Thanks. And Louis, when we were discussing, you had a little anecdote on the lead time for transformers and how that can tie into these conversations. Oh, Louis, you're on mute, I think.
Oh, my apologies. That's an interesting one because when you have an asset such as a transformer, it can easily sit there for 40 years and everybody forgets about it. But in a lot of facilities, it ends up being a key single point of failure, and one of the problem or things that a lot of people are often surprised at is the fact that you can easily be faced with a 30-week delivery time to get a replacement for that, and it doesn't matter how resilient the rest of your building is. If you're suddenly faced with the prospect of being without power for 30 weeks because you have a single piece of equipment fail, and that's to tie that back into the asset management part of it is to simply to understand when you do perform your asset management analysis, is to understand the risks associated with specific pieces of equipment and replace equipment when it's time, before they start to run a real risk of failure.
Absolutely. Thank you. Melissa, you've been gracious enough to manage some of the questions for me whilst we've been having this conversation. So could I pass it over to you to see where we are on the questions through the Q&A panel?
Absolutely, Malcolm. We have some really great questions that have come in today. Let's start out with the first one that soared to the top of the list here. How do you manage the problem in remote communities of supporting high technological solutions put in place for resiliency? The solution, if not maintained, is worse than the lower technological options or the lower tech options.
Who wants to take that on?
I can start that one off, and then others can chime in. I think it's an interesting dichotomy that is presented there: the high technology versus, I guess, I don't want to say more antiquated type of approach to how we design for resilience. It's a very interesting dichotomy, and I think in some senses it might be worth considering whether or not high technology always is better or is more resilient. Sometimes passive designs, whether it's your mechanical, electrical, or even your building envelope systems, can be much more resilient than a high technological solution. And I think it goes back to that point of really taking a step back and looking at what values need to be represented in this resilient design and choosing from there the appropriate technological solutions, high technology or not. So I think that's something to be considered.
If I can perhaps add to Andrew's comment, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think that the location, like Jared asked, the location of a community determines what the right answer is in terms of resilience. But high-tech solutions also gives us opportunities to do things to be able to support communities remotely that low-tech options doesn't give us. I think of remote water treatment facilities where, as long as we have adequate internet access, the process engineer that designed that plant actually has the ability to remotely monitor it, and it's something that in the past simply wasn't possible because the technology simply didn't exist.
Yeah, that's a good point, Louis. And we just have a few minutes left here, so let's see if we can get through another question or two. So the only constant in building and community design is change. The pace of evolving design standards, approaches, labeling, etc., is almost continually evolving. In contrast to historical changes, were very periodic. As engineers and advisors, what challenges and opportunities does this bring for us?
I'll tee that one off again, or Carma can take it on.
Yeah, Carma, go for it.
Go ahead, okay. Carma.
Well, I know we just have a couple minutes, but I think Ruben brings up a really good point. I mean, things are changing so rapidly. Technology is almost demanding that we have instant answers. And I think what Malcolm talked about at the beginning of our session is how there's such a higher level of complexity in problems. So, in some ways it's an opportunity if we can be more collaborative and be more multidisciplined in our approaches to solutions. But the challenge is the timeliness, I think, especially when we're up against schedules, deadlines, budgets, public expectations. All of these things strike a balance. But I think no longer is there such a thing as the engineer that knows all the answers. That just, maybe that existed in one point in time, maybe Da Vinci's time, but it certainly isn't the way things are now. So we have to be open to knowing what we know and what we don't know, and collaborating with our peers, and much beyond the engineering. Like, we planners, emission specialists, all kinds of different fields of science need to come into play, as well as all of the human aspects as well.
Great. Thank you, Carmen.
Thanks, Carmen.
We're about at the end of our session here. Sorry, Malcolm, did you have the closing statement?
Just the general closing observation. I think, Carmen, your point is very well taken, that this is about integration, and integration both on our side as the solution providers, but then also integration with our clients and the end users for the facilities. Even what comes to mind with the previous question was, beyond technical solutions, is there even an economic opportunity for a remote First Nation if there is new technology going in? we obviously need to provide the training and maintenance for the individuals to keep their equipment up and running, but can that then be used in other remote First Nations communities who have similar equipment? So starting to expand not only the integration conversation on our side, but that co-development conversation with our clients and end users as well. So hopefully, for those of you who have been through the session, I think plenty to think about. No clear-cut solutions. They need to be developed on your project specifically and with your clients. And so thanks all for taking the time to attend. And with that, I think it's a wrap on our part. And over to you, Melissa, for instructions to people.
Yes, we're just going to take a 30-minute break and we'll return at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And we encourage you to take some time to go into the networking rooms with other attendees. And I believe Malcolm's actually going to be starting a public networking session right after this, and maybe we can discuss some of those outstanding questions that were left that we unfortunately couldn't get to today. So he would love to connect with others, so please join him. And if for whatever reason you want to avoid Malcolm, you can also contact other colleagues and go into the networking area at the bottom of the lobby and click on your colleagues' names. You can form your own public breakout rooms. You can join established rooms. You can invite people in a private chat. So please do. Enjoy your break, and we look forward to seeing you at 11. Thanks again. Thanks to all our panelists, and we'll see you shortly.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.